Yeah, so running through a little bit of the agenda, we'll talk briefly about the demographics of the modern workplace, the landscape and the shifting attitudes among these first-generational workers that you've had in your workplaces, the opportunity presented to you today and in the future, the letters that you might read about the LGBT community, how the language has evolved in the multi-generational workplace, and then we'll share with you some resources. There'll also be a time for questions at the end.
We thought it would be helpful to level set in terms of what we see today in the modern workplace. And we're all out there in the workplace and we've all seen this, but this is the first time in U.S. history where we have 5 generations of workers working together. And these demographics are from the Department of Labor. Year after next, more than half of our workforce will be under the age of 44. One note I would call out on this, it's not this LGBTQ plus identities in the workplace, not a young youth issue. It applies to everyone. It is across the spectrum, but I think this does give a good idea of what we are seeing in the modern workplace and how the diverse individuals are bringing their diverse identities to work.
When we're talking about things that are important to millennials, we're not just talking about 17-year-olds anymore. We're talking about this block of 25 to 44, which are not just your interns, are your senior managers now.
Very true. I'm on the cusp of Gen X, and to see that 59 at the other end kind of puts everything in perspective. We thought it'd be fun to test your knowledge. You can answer to yourself. We'll ask you a couple of questions to set the stage. What percentage of U.S. adults do you think identify as LGBTQ+?
8.
That's dead on. That's perfect. This number is actually much lower when you look at the demographics of South Carolina.
Yeah, Tyler and I and Bryant were talking about this as we were planning for this. In South Carolina, it's about 3.5%. Does that mean South Carolina is different from any other state? No. It means we need to do better work when it comes to self-identification, creating environments where people feel safe to come out. But yeah, so 8% is the number. What percentage of U.S. adults identify as transgender? This gets a little hazier, but was that
1%? Less than 1?
about 2%?
Yeah, when we talk about this, I think there's a perception of it's either nobody or you see it in the media so much, it must be 20% of all young people are trans. This number is around the same number of people who have red hair in the United States. It's not huge, but 2% of the US population is enough for you to be paying attention in your workplace, right? If you have 2%, you have 50 employees, one of them statistically is likely to be in the transgender community. If you have a lot of employees and you don't know any of them in the transgender community, you probably have bigger issues. You need to start building a place that's safe for these people to come out or safe for them to apply to work for you. Because I promise you, if you work for a large company, trans people and LGBT people work for you already.
Yeah, and to amplify that point, the final question, what percentage of U.S. adults say they know someone who is transgender? 44. So near half of Americans interviewed, and this was a Pew Research Center survey, summer 2022, so very recent and a large audience of survey participants. So we're nearing half of workers say they know someone who is transgender. It could be a family member, it could be a partner, it could be a neighbor. So taking that into account as we create safe, inclusive workspaces is very important.
Yeah, it's important because right, these folks are not trans but are looking for places still that honor and dignify their trans coworkers and their trans friends and their trans family members as they decide where to work. This is not just an issue about, hey, we need to make sure it's safe for the 2% of our community. This is an issue that says these 44% of you are looking for a place that they could conceivably recommend their trans friend or their trans cousin to come work for as well.
So now a bit on shifting attitudes among diverse generational workers. Just wanted to cover some of the pressures that are driving this change. So we have public policies, certainly. We have customers, employees, investors, and boards. And I think Bryant was going to touch a bit on the policymakers and public policy.
Sure. So when you think about, and I mentioned working in local government, so you think about that perspective that all those percentages they were sharing fit within our demographics. So how are the policies that we're making, how are they impacting others around? Are they making things more inclusive for them? Is it making harder for them? And so part of that work in terms of our atmosphere is making sure, and I'll use the statement that was made earlier about inclusive excellence. So how are we making sure that the demographics of the people working within our organizations match what we see in the community? That's going to allow us to make sure that the policies, the procedures, the things that we're making are going to be inclusive and going to attract the people that we want to work there. That offers them not only the safe space in their work, but they can ensure that others in their communities have an opportunity to have a say in what they're doing.
Can you tell her a bit on customers?
Yeah, I think customers are super, super important right now. This sounds like hyperbole, but it's not. The LGBT community in the United States spends $1.7 trillion every single year. This is not just an issue for Subaru, who's making cars for a certain community, right? The LGBT community, for Bryant. The LGBT community spends their money here, and I want it to stay here. I want to collect those tax revenues, and I want them to go into your business. And to do that, it starts with a place where people want to work, and it starts with a place where people want to shop. There was a survey that just came out from the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce that said LGBTQ customers are 75% likely to change brands when they know you're LGBT inclusive, or when they know you're not LGBT inclusive.
Is it okay to ask a question now, or do I need to wait?
Sure. There'll be a spot for questions at the end as well, but I'd be happy
Well,
to.
it's just, I've heard it 3 times already, and
Yeah.
I work in recruiting for Michelin, and my goal is to bring people here. I want them to move and come to this community
Me
to
too.
work for Michelin. And I'm open and wanting to bring the most diversity I possibly can, but then they study information about that area and are not feeling warm and fuzzy. So,
Yeah.
you know, even though we can be,
So the question is, what can Michelin do for the community?
yeah, well, it's also how the community, you know, how do we make the community image different? Because we can be open to bringing that in, but how do we make, anyway, sorry, that was maybe a little bit off.
Let me share an anecdote. Because I agree, this is a concern, right? Like when I Google Greenville, South Carolina, and I'm thinking about moving here, I don't always see that Greenville, South Carolina just hired a chief diversity officer, right? That is so cool. I might see there are issues going on in the light, right? That is a PR nightmare. And it makes it difficult for folks to want to. But you all have real power. For those of you who lived here for some time, you probably remember in 1996, Greenville County passed a resolution that said the LGBT community is not welcome here and we won't spend our money. That caused the Olympic Committee, as they were going to Atlanta, to put the torch in a van and drive it through Greenville County.
It also happened in Atlanta where I lived at the time. Cobb County, north of Atlanta, did the same thing.
As far as I know, that is the only instance in the United States of the Olympic Committee putting a torch in a van and driving it through a whole county. There were activists working on sunsetting that for 24 years. And it wasn't until the year 2020 when businesses, like the folks here, like the folks at the Greenville Chamber of Commerce, got involved and said, hey, this is not just bad for the 3.5% of our community, for the 8% of your community, maybe. This is bad for us. This impacts our ability to recruit and attract and retain talent. And you know what? It took 90 days to go away after that.
Yeah, I think a couple of things you can do. I think recruit diverse candidates, partner with diverse organizations. Michelin is a big name, right? That's a lot of heft behind it.
You have a lot of power.
You use your public policy people to, in as much as you can, change policies. I mean, South Carolina is not alone. There are other red states that have diverse cities, right? I mean, we can name them all. I think potentially look at what those other states are doing to attract and retain. I think retain is key. You can attract, but then you want to retain. And we'll touch on a bit more of that later in terms of things that businesses and business owners can do to make sure that they are retaining diverse.
And things aren't all doom and gloom either. This June, the New York Times wrote an article about how fantastic it is to be an LGBTQ business owner in the city of Greenville. Right? It is fantastic to live here.
Yeah. So there is positive, but there is definitely work to be done. Certainly with employees, we're going to cover that. In terms of investors and boards, as I said, this is kind of where the space that I work in with DEI. BlackRock is an investment, very large investment organization, will no longer invest or go public with an organization that does not have a diverse board. Boards are hyper-focused on diversifying themselves, both corporate boards and not-for-profit community boards, because the board reflects the company. So these are, for boards, it's now critical. Just last week, there was a case very similar to the affirmative action case before it's at the Supreme Court. And I need to do a little research, but I believe it's the same group brought the affirmative action case, also sued NASDAQ, the listing agency, because NASDAQ now has implementing a rule that requires any company listed on NASDAQ has to report on their diversity. And the next step would be to have diverse board members. They were sued in the Fifth Circuit in Louisiana. The court came back last week and struck down that the suit against NASDAQ. They upheld the NASDAQ ruling. So that is a win for board diversity. Certainly we do anticipate it will go to the Supreme Court. And I think the question then is, we've seen how courts have ruled on, say, education or affirmative action. Will they be that quick to make those types of rulings when it comes to business? The Supreme Court is traditionally more business friendly, so we shall see. But these are some of those factors that are driving.
Brian, did you want to?
I was just going to say really quickly to her point, and this is a shameless plug for us in the city, but if you have not liked our social media, during the Pride Parade was celebrated across our social media. There was just a huge story about an inclusive playground, a very inspirational story I would encourage you to look up, about a child that has a disability and is unable to play with her brothers and sisters, and so this new playground, his family donated this money and created this new playground. And so things are happening here, but I think it takes the voice, as you mentioned, of others, sharing those stories so that those things become the front things that people see. And part of that also too, we have a municipal inequality index score that we work on constantly, so if people are looking and identify LGBTQ, they're looking at that city and seeing what they have. They can actually look at what that city does, how inclusive they are, what kind of things they offer. And so those are some of the things I think just off the top that we can be working toward to help you and to help this entire community as well.
Yeah. Brian, we shared the percentage of people that are LGBTQ that are
Tyler and I think we originally connected at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce annual meeting that my team leader presented at and our team actually went to. And when we dug into it, the focus was really LGBTQ plus representation on corporate boards. We started to dig into the numbers. We saw that 8% of the population identifies as LGBTQ plus. 0.7% of boards currently are LGBTQ plus. That is changing, but and that expands across aspects of diversity. We just did a presentation for Black professionals on boards, 8 or 9% maybe. Latinx on boards, 6 or 7%. Women on boards. At the current pace that they're going, the Russell 3000 listing of companies, it will take 22 more years to have board parity. That means 50-50. So there's still work to be done. I think boards are, oftentimes they can be a bit slower and a bit more conservative, but they are aware of this issue and they are leading the way, and they are certainly exerting pressure on their companies to drive that DEI.
And also the same thing about corporate boards, as I will about nonprofit boards. I think there is a sense of folks to say, the people we want to put in these seats are not here. That is a lie. There are qualified LGBTQ professionals who live here and live wherever you are, live where your business, live where your corporate board is, that not only have the qualifications to be on your board, but can excel there. That will bring an extra element to you, to your company, to your team, to your nonprofit, that will take you to the next level. When we're talking about nonprofit boards, if you're not serving your whole community, what are you doing? Right? If you have this blind spot of there's nobody on our board who's in the LGBT community who can talk about how these programs might be missing 3 to 8% of your community, that's a pretty big blind spot for you. You should consider, how do we find a person that can target that community, that can speak to those issues so we don't leave them behind. If you're a nonprofit leader in the room, I'm sure you're doing really fantastic work in your community. I'm positive of it. But you're leaving people behind by not having at least one seat at the table for the LGBT community.
Tyler,
Yes.
first of all, I want to thank the panel. All right, I'm going to ask a question, and I may get run out of the room for answering this question. So I understand that risk. Sometimes there are obvious indicators. Say, you can look at me and tell that I'm, or assume that I'm black, right? You can assume that someone's female,
Yep.
and what have you.
Yep.
There aren't as many obvious indicators
That's right.
that someone's LGBT.
Yeah.
How do we overcome, so we talk about identifying folks for the boards and things like that. How do you overcome that?
That's a great question, and it's a valid point. I think 15, 20 years ago, it would have been a very different conversation. Now I think those candidates are going to tell you. Their resume will list diverse organizations. Now, they could be allies, which is fine. We need allies just as much as we need LGBTQ professionals. Their LinkedIn profiles, their social media, the organizations that they may volunteer with. I personally, if you're interviewing me, I'm going to out myself to you in the first few minutes because I'm going to reference my partner, Nicholas. There are, and as it relates to boards, that is the exact advice that we're giving people. It doesn't matter what type of aspect of diversity you represent. You could be a black, queer, female. If you want to get on the board and you want that diversity, you've got to put that out there, highlight that on your LinkedIn, on your social media, on your resume. I certainly wouldn't question. And we'll get into that a bit later, as leaders don't question people who you may have an inkling but not be sure of. But I think more, and particularly as you get into millennial and Gen Z, generations, they're going to tell you. They're going to make it pretty obvious, and because they want to see how you, all of us in this room, respond to that.
And you can ask. On the board application form, on many of your boards, it says, right, like, check here if you're black, check if you're a woman. We want to know our board diversity. You can put that on the application form. You can straight up say, right, check here if you identify as trans, if you identify as bisexual. And by and large, if you include that, folks will. They don't have to, but they might. That would be a really great step for you. The other thing I will say is it does have to be intentional, right? For some of us, like me, you can look at me and tell that I'm a little gay. But that's not always the case.
That is not always.
For some people, you might have to ask. You might have to say, hey, we are looking to recruit diverse candidates. Can you tell me if you are the LGBT? That is not an offensive thing to say. They don't have to answer that question if they're uncomfortable with it. And you will have to come to peace with it. They might not, depending on what your brand reputation is like. A little bit later, I'll talk about a scenario that I had that was very similar to that. But I would encourage you, right? If you are looking to diversify your board, it starts with you being intentional about that.
Yeah, and I think too, one final thing, if you're recruiting from universities, most, if not all universities now have diversity organizations. Work with those organizations to find candidates. So, what does DEI mean to workers? This is a lot of words on screen. What this basically says, last year EY did a broad survey of about 3,000 employees at larger employers to gauge their perspective on diversity in the workplace. So certainly 92%, which we're almost at 100, of workers surveyed, and this was cross-generation. This was not strictly millennial Gen Z. This was across generations. 92% of workers say company culture does have an impact on their intent to stay with their current employer. 76% of millennials said they would leave if DEI initiatives were not offered. 59% of all survey respondents felt that DEI meant equitable job opportunities for all, although different people define diversity differently. And half of Gen Z, millennials, and the LGBT plus professionals said their company's position on social impact or social issues impact their decision to stay a great deal or a lot. I think the point of this is our employees, our workers, our teammates are watching. They're paying attention. It goes back to that recruiting question. It goes back to the retention question. And I think, Bryant, in terms of like what we're hearing from Greenville businesses.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the big part that you walk away from this is, I think, elaborating on what you're saying is, especially our younger workforce, they're really looking at what we're doing, not so much what we're saying. So they may come into the organization and we're talking about diversity, we're talking about all these things we're going to do, but they're watching to see what's happening. And that hourglass, as we turn that over, turns over much quickly. So if they're not seeing the initiatives being done, if they're not seeing it happen, they're looking for the next place that's going to do that. And so someone in a role like me, it's very, very intentional for me to connect with our employees, understand where they are and what needs they have. One of the things I do with our new employees, I always go around the room and ask them where they're from, and then I ask them something they like about their job. And generally they'll start off by saying something like, I like my supervisor, I like people I work with, I like my hours. And I generally flip that and say that those are the same reasons that people end up leaving jobs, because they don't like their boss, they don't like their coworkers, they don't like their hours. And so harnessing and keeping that close to yourself to remember why it is that you decided to pursue that opportunity, and making sure that that stays within the fabric of what they have. Because if not, this is what ends up happening. They end up saying, oh, well, apparently they said they're going to leave. But apparently then you can see that that's kind of the response that it has. Oh.
Yeah,
Go back.
numbers and think that they're low, but anybody who does workplace survey and data will tell you it is impossible to get this level of agreement in the workplace on a lot of issues. These numbers are very, very high for the things your employees are telling you are important to them.
Yeah, and the 76% of millennials saying they would leave an employer. When you get to the next generation, Gen Z, it goes up to about 85 to 90%. So it's not changing. It's going in that direction.
I'm a millennial. This has happened to me. Around 8 years ago now, I interviewed for a job in Spartanburg. I was really, really excited about it. It was a pretty big race. And ultimately I got offered the job, but during this interview, I'm sure all of you have had these interviews where you're just so nervous. There's like 4 people sitting across the table from you. And I could like feel myself being sweaty. And they didn't have any public policy positions out that I could find about the LGBT community. So I said, right, I have to ask. I have to sit at this interview table and say, like, figure out a way to say, do you like gay people? Because there is a price, right? There's a price for me to go in the closet. But it wasn't what they were paying me. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars more. That's an expensive journey. That's a joke. No, but I had to figure out a way to say, like, let me come to this understanding with you of what are you doing for your LGBT employees so that I can know, is this a good place for me to work? Am I going to be safe here? So I asked them about what they were doing for their diverse communities that live there. I didn't really have a good answer for me. We're a good place to work, we treat all of our employees fairly, and that was not what I was thinking of, right? I wanted to know about the gay issue. So I just straight up said, I said, hey, what do you do for your LGBT employees? Here are some things my current employer is doing. Tell me about if you're doing these things, right? Do you have a target for LGBT executives? Do you have a business resource group for your LGBT employees? And they told me no on all of those things. In the end, they told me we treat all of our employees equitably. Because on Fridays, we buy everyone a Chick-fil-A sandwich. So there are a number of issues with that. We won't touch the red hot iron. But I'm also a vegetarian. So there's multiple issues there. Ultimately, I declined the job. It would have been a fantastic position for me that my skills fit inside of. But it was not a place that I felt comfortable sitting on the other side of that interview table saying, this is a job that I'm excited about taking. This is a job that I can feel safe coming to every day, that I know my boss is going to be cool with me being out. And there is a number that would make folks forget that, but what I want is for you to offer a full competitive set of benefits, a full business resource group that folks are excited about going to, so that you have a competitive workplace, because millennials and Gen Z and Gen X are turning down your jobs. Not just because you're not paying enough, but because they want these other things. They want you to make public statements. They want you to be cool with the LGBT community. They want it to be safe. For them to spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week of their life in an office where they know they don't have to also think about, like, what kind of story am I going to tell about my weekend? How can I describe my partner and the people that I live with and my friends? And that is really difficult. You're not getting a full person. When I'm sitting here thinking about, how do I filter this story to make sure that I don't get fired? I just want to do my job. And you all should be building a place where I can just do it.
And that happens all too frequently, unfortunately. So we've sort of talked about what the workplace looks like in terms of ages and diversities. Now we're going to dive into some of the diverse identities that you are going to encounter in our modern workplace. I think this is cute. Gender is really a lot less like that and a lot more like that. And then in terms of attraction, identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, emotional attraction, physical attraction. And what do these mean?
Great question. So you're probably familiar with some of these. We won't linger here for too long. We want to make sure that you all have a base for talking about these things with your employees. Sure, many of you feel like this is such a difficult topic for me to discuss that I don't know where the landmines are. Right? I might get in trouble just by saying one of these phrases. And I don't want that for you. At the end of the day, this is not that complicated, I promise. Sex assigned at birth really means when you popped out, this is what the doctor identified you as. And you got, for many of us, stuck with, right? The most common terms that you'll hear, female, male, and intersex. We did not include this number, but just about 1.5% of the US population identifies as intersex. This is something that is either ambiguous, where you have chromosomes that don't represent the genitals that you were born with. Gender identity, this is the one that's most commonly in the media right now that you're going to hear a lot about. You'll hear terms like cisgender and trans. Cis means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth, and trans means you identify with a gender that you were not necessarily assigned at birth. You'll also hear non-conforming or non-binary or gender expansive. This just means there are people who think about the gender binary not just on one flat plane from male to female, but there are lots of different types of expressions. If you have questions about that, or you have employees who feel that way, identify that way, you have some questions about that, right, respectfully. And we'll talk about that as well. Gender expression. This is totally different than the sex you were assigned at birth or the gender you identify with. This is how you express that gender. That can be androgynous, meaning you look, to my eyes, somewhere in between the traditional male and female spectrum. Traditionally feminine, traditionally masculine. Oh, and then again, right, these are my interpretations of these words. People have different interpretations of these words. I would encourage you we'll have some resources at the end of this review. And there are folks who have other gender expressions, and there are folks who express themselves differently on different days. I would encourage you to politely have those conversations with your employees and your coworkers. And then emotional attraction. There are people who separate this emotional attraction from physical attraction, right? There are people who connect more with people of the same gender or different genders than them. There are people who identify, hey, I am not typically attracted emotionally to women, but I am to men and other genders, or vice versa. And then there's physical attraction, which you all are probably very familiar with. This is the one we talk about most as it comes to the the G, and the B identities. I am physically attracted to men or to women, or to other genders.
And to men and women.
To men and women, yes. There are other experiences of physical attraction. These are the most prominent still in our communities that we're talking about. We're talking about being lesbian, being gay, being bisexual, this sort of stuff.
Great. Two things I would just call out on this slide. You'll see sex assigned at birth and gender identity are core, innate to the individual. Other aspects may have more, be more impacted by cultural environment, but sex assigned at birth certainly is biological. And gender identity, more and more studies are showing that gender identity is a basis in science. And then some how multi-generational workers define identities, just some common terms that you will likely hear as we get more diverse in our workplaces.
There are 9 terms here. I won't linger on all of them. I want to start, though, the top left here, LGBT+, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA. Folks who are not inside the LGBT community, this can frequently sound like alphabet soup. There are a lot of letters. I don't understand which one of these I should use. By and large, pick one of these. No one's really going to be offended if you give it your best shot. I will tell you, the most popular one right now, especially among millennials and Gen Z, is LGBTQ. If you want to defer to one of those, I would recommend LGBTQ. That is, by and large, I think it's something over 50% of folks now think LGBTQ is the best term to use. But any of these are fine. Don't stress yourself out about it. Very frequently I hear people try to say 4 letters in a row and then apologize. LGBT is fine, and that is, I think you can memorize those 4 letters. Transitioning or transition, that means that there is a person who is on their journey or has been on the journey of changing their gender or gender expression. The other big one I want to point out is trans or transgender. This refers to people who identify as a gender that they were not assigned at birth. And I would caution you against saying trans or transgender. Those terms are becoming offensive in the trans community because they refer more to an act than to a person themselves.
And then, so for most of us, this might be old hat, we're familiar with these, but just if you're less familiar, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, ally, and now the A also represents ace and asexual. So when you're talking about the romantic or physical attraction in the previous slide, you may have someone who is asexual. They are not sexually attracted to individuals. Or you may have someone who is aromantic. They are not romantically attracted to other individuals. So you will hear these terms more and more frequently.
The A standing for ally has really fallen out of favor. It was something you saw very frequently in like the early 2000s, and now almost exclusively refers to asexual.
But any of those letters are safe.
Yep.
You do have.
I think it's going to be a quick one. Thank you for taking my question down. So I can't remember which one I am. I'm 57, so I'm on the cusp of,
Great.
yeah. So when I was growing up, queer was horrible. You did not say that word. My daughter uses it frequently now. I don't understand the flip. Is there a short answer on that, or do I see you after the session?
The short answer is you're right. Queer was absolutely a slur. And for some people, still can be used as a slur. Queer is a term that has been very reclaimed inside the LGBT community. I really dearly like the word queer because there's not, you'll notice we talk about all those terms, there's not a fantastic term that's an umbrella term. You can say LGBTQIA+, or for many of us, we just say the word queer. It has been reclaimed. I would caution you to consider how you say it if you're not inside the LGBT community. Just like other slurs, I wouldn't go around saying, the queers are up to things. But I would say, right, you can say something like, oh, this person is in the queer community.
Thank you.
Yeah, I came late to queer. I've always been a gay man, but for the reason that Tyler said, in terms of it's a good umbrella, it feels very inclusive of the various communities. So I will use it, but I mean, none of these terms will get you into trouble as long as it's from a place of respect and honest
Please mean
interest,
well, yeah.
and caring, right? So, one note on this that I found, and when we were discussing this presentation, as the language evolves, we are seeing the younger generations in the workplace have expanded the language that we use. I appreciate it, moving toward the older generation. I appreciate that we have the ability to expand the way that we describe ourselves, our loved ones, our partners, our friends. So just in terms of that language piece, I know it can sometimes be confusing.
Scary.
It can be scary, it shouldn't be, but it also creates home for a lot of diverse individuals.
Can I ask a really quick question?
Yeah.
Sorry, back to the other side. When people are talking about their when we're talking about pronouns, is it generally gender identity or expression, or could it be both?
It's both.
Okay.
So the question was, can you go back one slide?
Yeah, sure.
So the question was, when we talk about pronouns, is it gender identity or is it gender expression? For many of us, it's both of those things, right? It's a signal of here's how I express my gender identity, right? Here's how I want people to think of me. Here's how I want to be perceived. But it also is a signal of your gender identity.
Would you see it different then? I mean, could it be,
Yeah, I think
could someone have a different, like what their gender identity is different than their gender expression listed as pronouns?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
think identity is how I see myself. Expression is how I present myself to you. So you could identify it in a different way than you present yourself.
And that happens in your private life too.
Right.
Like, you're a different person when you're hanging out with your aunts and uncles than you are when you're with your friends, when you're with your coworkers. And for many folks in the Gen Z and younger communities, you're seeing that very frequently. Right? It's not even that they're in the closet at work, they're using a different gender expression when they come to work. Because this is the type of person that they perceive they need to be, or perceive themselves as the type of person that they must be, or they want to be, inside of the workplace.
And then, so some tips and some tools, and I won't go too frequently. I think we said we covered a lot of these, but just as you're leading diverse teams, think about these types of leadership attributes. Certainly ensure that work sites are accessible and safe. And this is not just physical. This is also mentally and emotionally safe. Model inclusive behavior and actions that you want your teams to reflect. It is okay to ask questions respectfully. If you have team members who come to you with questions and you can answer them, you should. If not, educate yourself or find an inclusive way to connect different team members so they can have a conversation. If there are questions, concerns, address those. Do not put them off. Do not ignore them. Do not think they will go away. And if you do have to intervene for your employees, do so in a respectful, non-confrontational way. But as leaders, it's incumbent upon us to ensure that everything we're talking about here, our workplaces are inclusive. Educate team members and always check those misconceptions. I think a lot of that just comes with not knowing and having questions. If you create an open and safe environment for your team and for your team members, then a lot of those misconceptions can be dispelled. And first and foremost, and I think we all know this, is respect team members' privacy. You can ask respectful questions, but don't pry into personal lives. Certainly do not pry into people's body parts or their bathrooms. And don't allow that on your teams as well. Like, do not create an environment where that is not ever okay.
This comes down to, respect people when they tell you who they are.
So thank you for all entertaining us. We do have some time for questions, so we did want to make sure we had enough time for anybody that has any questions. You can raise your hand, or if you prefer to stand up. Yes.
So I recently am part of our founding employee resource group, at my work called Safe Space. One of the things we're challenged with is not being able to politically lean or religiously lean into conversations, but yet that's so much part of the conversation. So what are some tips of how do we navigate that conversation without leaning too far into that? Or is that a conversation that we take to leadership saying, hey, it's hard to have these conversations to a certain extent, you know, this has to be.
Can I take this one? I would wholeheartedly reject the framework that talking about LGBTQ identities is political. Because your senior leaders probably will push back on that. You have some work to do inside of your employee resource group to make sure that it doesn't become political, because it can. There is one side of this conversation that has co-opted some of these works, right? Has made these things dangerous and scary to talk about, because that's how they get. And you can reject that and say, right, we are not talking about politics. We are asking you to respect that queer people work here. And what we want from you is not political. What we want from you is we want a place for us to gather to talk about our issues, right? That's the very first thing that you want in an employee resource group, is I need to talk to people like me. Then you can plan, right, like how do we change some of these smaller things? How do we build inclusive policies that, again, are not political, right? It's not political to take your ERG and look at your employee handbook and say, does it matter if I wear a dress to work? And if it doesn't, let's delete that part of the employee handbook. Does it matter if it says, is it political for it to say in my employee handbook, we are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of gender identity and sexuality? That's not political. If they push back on that being political, you can reject that. Right, the world is more clearly divided than I've seen in a long time. And there are people at your workplace who are going to try to make it political. Don't let them.
Yeah. I would differentiate between political and policy. And I would very respectfully but strongly push back against the notion that you cannot be LGBTQ plus and religious, and that there is a divide there. One of the most interesting panels I've ever seen was a company, and I was trying to remember who it was, sought it out to Equal, and they presented on it. They had a panel on LGBTQ and religion, and they invited people. They had different religious groups. They invited them. They invited someone from the LGBTQ, someone who was trans, and they had a very respectful conversation about these topics. But I would differentiate between policy and political, and I would certainly say that there is a respectful way to discuss these issues, and we should be, and the workplaces where they should be, those discussions should be happening.
There's a fantastic group of LGBT affirming churches here in the Upstate, and that could be a really great way to ease your way into that too, to say, like, hey, this is not religious. This is not religious on one side or another. There are folks here who believe that you can be religious and you can be queer.
Yeah, check out Trevor Project. They have someone on their staff. They are amazing. I saw them speak. They actually came to an EY call, and they spoke about having to, first of all, bring together their religious views and their LGBTQ identity, but now how that's opened up so many other doors in different communities, particularly if you think about rural communities or communities that may have a stronger religious history.
What else?
Hey, my daughter is part of the queer community. I would really like, we are soon to be a part of the political season. I wanted to know what candidates on county council, city council, I want to know who is supporting your causes so that I can vote appropriately. Where can I find it?
Yeah, I can hit that. And then I can hit that. No, it's a
Tracy, you mentioned
I think nationally, so for statewide races like Senate races, congressional races, you can check out HRC, Human Rights Campaign. They rank politicians based on either past policy positions or stated policy positions. When you get to the state and the local level, I would defer to my colleagues.
That's it. Most of the conversation and most information you're going to see is going to be related to economics, affordable housing, those types of things. I think the safest approach to that would be looking at what sort of things they're looking to advance. I hate to say do that, but and read what that basically says. But other than HRC and others, there's not generally been like a scorecard that's at the local level for that. But I would look at what you see that they're promoting and going after to help you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's brilliant. You just opened my eyes and helped me. I think two issues you could look at in our community would be housing, gentrification, and public transportation. And where they kind of fall on those, you can probably get a good idea on where they would land on other diverse issues. And thank you. Help me.
That was a good question.
So just to add to that, please pay attention to the school boards because but my question is, thank you so much for the tips about how to create safe spaces internally. And how do we as public-facing organizations who deal with different vendors, different clients, different partners, how do we create a safe space for our LGBTQ employees externally?
So I'm going to go to policy here and say you need to go look at your internal values first and make sure that aligns with diversity and with accepting the LGBT community. And then I point you to two things. I would say for your vendors, in your vendor contract, it should say something that probably already says about gender and race, that vendors are prohibited from discriminating against people on the basis of federally protected classes. It's still, I'm not a lawyer, it's still pretty squishy on sexuality and gender identity. I would encourage you to write it into your vendor contract. And to write and to only do business with people who have policies that say employees are prohibited from discriminating on the basis of sexuality and gender identity. Those things are maybe protected at the federal level right now. And what you can do is to make sure that you are giving your vendor money and your employee time into communities that are already doing that.
Yeah, I say, and check you can exert positive influence on those vendors by asking those questions. How diverse are their suppliers? Do they have diversity initiatives in place? And then looking at their policies and procedures, their value statements as well.
Can I respond to her question?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I work in politics, and I'll say this: when you looking at candidates, especially city and county council, most of them, with the exception of one or two that are Republican, do not agree with LGBTQ, period. There are some Democrats who also feel the same way, who will not say it publicly. When you look at how they vote, you look at who they interact with, the conversations they're having, they too will go against the LGBTQ community. So my advice to you, me and Wilson in this room, is run for office. Like, if you support LGBTQ, run for office, even if you don't think you're going to win, because what it does is it forces them to now listen to people like Tyler. Because Tyler and I have had this conversation. We've worked with certain councilmen who don't necessarily agree, but they want to learn more. And so it forces them to listen, to the issues.
I mean, from a board perspective, the first advice we give people is run for the board. Express your interest in the board. Get on the school board. Get on the library board because we know what's going on, right? And even if you don't make it, you do raise those issues. I think that's excellent.
We have a question from the council in the back.
Well, I was going to piggyback. I was going to say what the gentleman said up here. I'm from the city of Clemson, and I'm also in politics. And one of the areas when it was pointed out to us, members from the LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce came and spoke with our council and our city administrator about the issues that they face in the city of Clemson, and not feeling as though it's a welcoming community, and also the municipal equality index was very low for the city of Clemson. So you have to be willing to listen, and also have people on board who are willing to truly be sincere and authentic about the work that is involved. And so we have taken that, and policy is important. If you have people at the table who understand and are willing to take up and review those policies, make those changes, become more welcoming. We still have a lot of work to do because we've made some changes and our index score has increased significantly. We were excited about that, but we had to do some work to make sure our policies were up to par and inclusive, also making sure our marketing was inclusive, that we offer positions. We now participate in the recruitment and come to some of the opportunities for job positions. So we are very much engaged and involved, but it took for members to come and talk to us and us to be willing to listen and do that work. And so, and I was going to ask that question because sometimes when doing that, we've increased and made sure that we're more inclusive, but we do have some members of our community who decide, this is not what I thought this was about, it values my religion or whatever, and they actually have walked away, and that's fine, because we knew we were going to lose some people, but for the greater good, it's just the right thing to do. And so you have to be willing to stand on that and do the right thing. So I would also say, get involved and get at that level where you can have some of that decision, be involved in some of those decisions that is currently being made.
I think that's a good transition to our last slide here. Let's talk a little bit about the resources available to you all. We got a lot, I know a lot of you participate in Out Equal already. We got a lot of these numbers from Out Equal. They offer a fantastic conference that talks in more depth about this. It's virtual. I would highly recommend. I would be happy to talk to you more. The LGBT Chamber is a local LGBT chamber here that covers all 10 counties of the Upstate. About 3 years old, and we have about 300 members. The Human Rights Campaign, Councilman Alicia Smith in the back was talking about the Municipality Equality Index. The Human Rights Campaign, they put out 2 surveys every year. They put out one for businesses. You probably see it in Pride Month on your TV where it says Verizon was scored a 100 out of 100 on the Corporate Equality Index. They also do one for cities. They rank just in the Upstate, Clemson and Greenville. And both of those cities have made fantastic progress on those scores over the last couple of years. Clemson, in 11 years, had never scored a single point on that survey. And last year, with council's help, we scored 33. And for the last 11 years, Greenville, South Carolina scored a 33, and last year scored a 55. If you're looking to bring in folks locally to talk to your company about diversity topics surrounding the LGBT community, AC Sport Pride offers some really fantastic trainings. And you probably saw this Saturday, Upstate Pride happened. It happened just 2 days ago, so now is a great time to start planning. How can I get my company to Pride next year? You have a full calendar year. This is not, going to Pride is not the end of the road, but it is a really great first step for your company. Show up to Pride so people notice.
I know we're getting ready to end here, and shameless plug again, sorry about that. But I did want to mention that change is happening. So I'll give an example. In our city manager's office, we actually have an LGBTQ plus liaison. Sorry, Megan, I'm embarrassed.
She's here.
But Megan Young, my roadie, is here as well. We work very, very close together in supporting our community. Our chief of police, Howard Long, also has an LGBTQ liaison in the police department as well that also helps out. And we wouldn't be able to do that without the fabulous support of our city manager, Ms. Shannon Levin, who's also in the audience today. She's an amazing support. So to think that all the things we're talking about here the pieces of those things can come together and making sure the right people are in the right place. So we need each of you in the effort to do this. Please feel free to come and talk to any of us. The resources here as well. We hope that you have a fabulous rest of your day. Thank you for enjoying us and giving us some time.